There's a sound that comes before the end of everything. I know that now, I didn't know it then. It's not an explosion. It's not screaming. It's quieter than that, a low, sustained hum that vibrates in your back teeth and makes the hairs on your arms stand up even under 3 layers of thermal shielding. It's the sound of something massive drawing power, something that has decided it's done waiting. I heard that sound for the first time on the 47th day of the Gorethian siege, and every single member of the Velkorath coalition who was still alive on that station heard it too. 47 days of holding on. 47 days of telling each other it would be okay, that the Galactic Assembly would send help, that someone would come. No one came. Not until the 48th day. And what came, I still don't have the right words for it even now. I've tried to write this down 4 times. 3 times I stopped because my hands were shaking too hard to hold the stylus. The 4th time I got halfway through and just sat there staring at the wall for what my bunkmate told me was 6 hours. She thought I'd gone catatonic. Maybe I had. But I'm going to finish it this time, because people need to know what happened at Velkorath. They need to know what we saw, what those beings did, what it cost them and what it cost us, and what it means for everyone alive in this galaxy right now. My name is Sira Vosanrin. I was a junior communications analyst aboard Velkorath Orbital Station 7. I was 26 years old. I thought I understood war. I didn't understand anything. Let me tell you about Velkorath Station before I tell you about the battle, because you need to understand what it was to understand what we almost lost. Velkorath Orbital was a coalition hub, not a military installation, not primarily. It was the kind of place where 17 different species had learned over about 200 years to exist in the same pressurized tube without killing each other. That's harder than it sounds. You've got Drelhari who need near-zero gravity to function properly. You've got Yanari who breathe a methane-nitrogen mix. You've got Kasavith who are so photosensitive that half the corridors have to be kept at near-total darkness, because standard lighting gives them neurological seizures. You've got my own people, Ithori. We're bipedal, oxygen-breathing, roughly humanoid, standard issue as far as the galaxy goes. The station had 712 permanent residents when the siege began. Researchers, engineers, administrators, a few merchants who'd set up shop in the commercial ring. A medical facility that was genuinely excellent, the best diagnostic array within 4 sectors. A school for the 40 or so children whose parents had decided that raising kids on a space station was somehow a reasonable life choice. I was not one of those children, but I'd been on Velkorath long enough that it felt like home. We also had a garrison. 80 coalition defense soldiers split between 3 species, Ithori, Drelhari, and 1 unit of Yanari in sealed environment suits. 80 soldiers, that had always seemed like enough. Velkorath wasn't a target. We were a research hub, a transit point, a diplomatic way station. Nobody attacks neutral ground. The Gorethians didn't care about neutral ground. I should tell you about the Gorethians. Not because I want to, but because you can't understand the fear if you don't understand what we were afraid of. The Gorethian dominion had been expanding for 60 years by the time they reached our sector. They didn't colonize. They didn't negotiate. They didn't make demands that could be met. They arrived, they assessed the strategic value of whatever was in front of them, and then they either claimed it or they burned it. No middle ground. No exceptions that anyone in the coalition could point to and say, here, they showed mercy here. Gorethians were large, not in the towering, dramatic way of some species. They weren't giants. They were broad and low to the ground, 4-limbed in the locomotion sense, though they had 6 additional manipulator appendages along their upper bodies. Their skin was a deep charcoal gray with these bioluminescent striations running along the flanks that pulsed with their emotional states. When they were calm, the lights were slow, almost beautiful. When they were angry, they strobed rapid fire. When they were about to kill something, the lights went completely dark. We knew that last part from footage. From the recordings that had leaked out of Harvini's colony and Setara outpost before those places went silent forever. Commander Reth Osler, our garrison commander, a 50-year-old Ithori career soldier with a shrapnel scar along his jaw from a border skirmish 15 years back, called a full station assembly on day 1 of the siege. I remember standing in the main concourse with about 600 other terrified people while he stood on a crate in the middle of the floor and spoke without a microphone, because the PA system had been the first thing we'd lost when the Gorethians had disabled our external communications array. He said, "We are going to hold this station. We are going to make this difficult for them, and we are going to transmit our situation on every frequency we can access, and we are going to keep doing that until someone hears us. That is the plan. Questions?" Nobody had questions. We were too scared for questions. He stepped down from the crate and went back to work. I liked Commander Osler. He never promised us things that weren't going to happen. He never told us everything was going to be fine. He just told us what we were doing, and then he did it alongside us. He died on day 31, a boarding breach in Section 4. He held the bulkhead door manually, physically held it, with his own body weight against a hydraulic failure, long enough for 11 civilians to get clear. Then the door gave, and the Gorethian breach squad came through, and that was the end of Reth Osler. After that, Lieutenant Commander Vane Selos took over. She was younger, maybe 35, and she had a different way about her. Less steady, more angry. I mean that as a compliment. Sometimes anger is the right tool. She was the one who figured out the gravity trick in Section 9. She was the one who got us 14 additional days by routing the power cycling through the life support redundancies in a way that made the Gorethian sensors read the station as more heavily damaged than it was. They kept pulling back to reassess, thinking we were about to catastrophically decompress. We weren't, but they didn't know that. 14 extra days. That's what Vane Selos' anger and cleverness bought us. It wasn't enough. On day 47, the Gorethian Dominion flagship, the Unbroken Meridian, we'd learned its designation from intercepted transmissions, moved into position directly above the station's primary hub. When that thing moved, you felt it even inside the station. A ship that size displaces enough space mass that the gravitational variance is perceptible, like standing on a bridge when something enormous passes underneath. That was when I heard the sound, the low hum, the power draw. We were in the communications bay, me and 2 other analysts, Jeth and Orvani, when it started. Jeth, who had been with Coalition Communications for 12 years and had worked 2 previous conflict postings, went very still the moment he heard it. "Jeth," I said, "what is that?" He didn't answer right away. He was looking at his readout. His hands were perfectly motionless on the console. "Jeth, thermal actuator cascade," he said. "On a vessel that size," he paused. "That's their primary weapon system charging." Orvani made a small sound, not quite a word. I looked at my own console. Our last working transmitter was still broadcasting on the emergency frequency we'd been using for 31 days. Still broadcasting our position, our status, our desperate looped signal into the void. No response. Not a single response in 31 days. "How long?" I asked. "Before they fire?" Jeth ran the calculation manually, the old-fashioned way, on a physical pad because our computation systems were down to 30% functionality. "At that charge rate, maybe 90 minutes, maybe a little more." 90 minutes. 712 people. Well, fewer than that now. 688 at last count after the casualties of 47 days. But still, 688 lives and the clock was running. Vane Selos arrived in the communications bay 8 minutes after the hum started. Someone had already told her. She looked at Jeth's numbers, and she looked at my transmitter readout, and she looked at the blank screen where responses should have been appearing for the past month. She sat down in the empty chair by the far console. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Keep broadcasting. Keep all frequencies open, everything we have." "Yes, Commander." She stood back up. She smoothed the front of her uniform, that small, automatic gesture of composure, and she walked back out into the corridor. I watched her go. I thought about the children in the school section. I thought about the Cassavith researchers in the darkened corridors who had no idea what was happening, because we hadn't been able to find a way to relay information to them without risking a panic that their physiology couldn't handle. I thought about old Dr. Fenrath, the Drelhari xenobiologist who had been on this station for 30 years, and whose entire life's work was stored in its research banks. I thought about a lot of things in those 90 minutes. And then, with about 7 minutes left on Jeth's estimate, something happened on my sensor board. I almost missed it. I was watching the Gorethian ship's power readings. I was watching because there's something compulsive about watching the thing that's going to kill you, as if paying close enough attention to it will somehow change what it does. My eyes were tracking the wrong thing. It was Orvani who caught it. Sierra, her voice was strange, flattened, like she was forcing it through something tight in her chest. Sierra, look at Sector 9 Delta. I looked. There were contacts on the deep-range scanner, far out, coming fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen on a scanner in my entire career. The return signature was wrong, completely wrong, too dense, too compact, too many individual mass readings clustered in too tight a formation. That's how I started. I don't know what that is, Orvani said. How many contacts? She ran the count twice, 3 times, her mouth moved silently. Orvani's how many? 412, she said, give or take the margin of error. I stared at her. 412 what ships? The profile doesn't match any fleet configuration I have in the database. They're not any Alliance class, not any Dominion class, not Yanari Collective, not any coalition vessel type I've ever seen. She looked up from her console and her eyes were very large. Sierra, they don't match anything. I opened the broadband channel. Commander Silos, Communications Bay, we have contacts. Sector 9 Delta, you need to see this. Her voice came back in seconds. On my way. The contacts were closing at a rate that should have been impossible. Whatever propulsion system those vessels were using, it wasn't anything in our database. The scanner kept trying to recalculate their speed and kept arriving at numbers that it then flagged as probable instrument error, because the numbers were so far outside expected parameters that the system assumed it was malfunctioning. It wasn't malfunctioning. Vane Silos came through the door at a run, which was the first time I'd ever seen her run anywhere. She stood behind me and looked at my screen for a long moment. Get me a visual, she said. We don't have the long-range optical array anymore. The Gorethians took that out in week 1. Short range. At that distance, it'll be. Try. I tried. What came back was grainy, pixelated, barely more than shapes against the starfield. But even through the degraded optics, even at that distance, the shapes were wrong. Different. Not wrong like broken or damaged, wrong like nothing I'd ever seen. They were dark. Almost completely dark, which is unusual for ships. Every vessel I'd ever seen in my career had some kind of running light, some radiation signature that caught the sensors in a visible way. These things were absorbing, like holes in the star field. You could see them not because of what they were emitting, but because of what they were blocking. And they were moving in a formation that was, I don't have a proper word for it, not a standard combat formation, not a patrol spread, something tighter and more purposeful than either of those, like a fist. Commander, Jeth said quietly, the Gorethian ship is changing its power profile. I switched back to my primary screen. He was right. The steady charge curve of the unbroken Meridian's weapon system had shifted. Not stopped, they hadn't stopped charging, but the shape of the curve had changed. Something on that ship had noticed the new contacts and was evaluating them. The new contacts were now close enough that our damaged scanners were starting to get cleaner readings. And the readings were, I stared at them. I recalibrated manually. I checked the sensor calibration sequence. I did everything you're supposed to do when your instruments are giving you something impossible. The readings didn't change. Those vessels, those 412 dark, impossible vessels, were doing something that our physics said was not possible to do at this speed. They were decelerating. Not gradually, not over thousands of kilometers right now. The rate of deceleration was so extreme that anything organic inside those vessels should have been reduced to a thin paste against whatever wall it happened to be nearest to. But there they were, decelerating, and not smearing into paste, presumably. What are they? Vane Silos asked, not to anyone in particular, to the universe, the kind of question you ask when you've run out of frameworks for understanding something. I didn't have an answer. But then one of the contacts on my scanner, the largest one, roughly centered in the formation, did something I hadn't seen any vessel do in my entire career. It hailed us. A direct line encrypted hail on a coalition emergency frequency, tight beam aimed directly at our station. Like whoever was flying, that thing knew exactly where we were, and exactly which frequency we were using, and had been listening to our transmissions for long enough to know how to talk to us. My hands were shaking when I opened the channel. The voice that came through was, I need to describe this carefully because it matters. It was a voice I didn't recognize from any species in my database, but the language was perfect. Perfect standard galactic, no accent that I could identify, crisp and clear in a way that made our own communications equipment sound like it was underwater by comparison. Like whatever transmission system, they were using operated on principles entirely different from ours, and was better by an enormous margin. The voice said, Velkorath Station 7, this is the USEF Harbinger's Point, Commanding Officer Admiral Theo Merck, United Sol Expeditionary Fleet. We have your distress signal. We have had your distress signal for 29 days. We apologize for the delay. We are here now. The communications bay was so quiet I could hear Orvani breathing. I pressed the transmit key. My voice came out steadier than I expected. USEF Harbinger's Point, this is Velkorath Station 7, Analyst Sira Voss Anrin. Commander Silos is present. Please identify your species affiliation and your... Human, the voice said, just that, one word, flat and certain. We are human. We are from the third planet of the Sol system. We have been aware of your coalition and the Gorethian Dominion for approximately 41 standard years. We have been watching the situation develop. We made a decision 29 days ago when your signal reached us. I looked at Vane Silos. She was staring at the speaker like she could see through it to the voice on the other side. What decision? She asked. A pause, not a long one, maybe 3 seconds, but the kind of pause that feels like something being chosen very carefully. We decided to come, said Admiral Theo Merck of the United Sol Expeditionary Fleet. The Gorethian vessel is charging its primary weapon. Our assessment gives you approximately 6 minutes. I recommend we continue this conversation after. Do you have any objection to us engaging the Gorethian fleet? Vane Silos stood very straight. Garrison commander, 23 years of coalition service, responsible for 688 lives and every resource allocation and every impossible choice for the past 31 days. She said no objection. Copy that, Commander. Please advise your people to brace. What's coming is going to shake the station. The channel didn't close, it just went quiet. And then the dark shapes on our scanner, all 412 of them, began to move. I have thought about how to describe the next 40 minutes for a very long time. I was watching it on a damaged scanner with degraded resolution from inside a battered station that had been besieged for 47 days. My instruments were compromised. My perspective was limited. Half of what I was seeing, I was processing through damage and adrenaline and 47 days of compressed terror, suddenly finding an outlet it didn't know how to handle. So I want to be honest about the limits of what I can tell you. I'm not going to dress this up as something more precise than it was. I'm going to tell you what I saw, what I heard, and what it felt like. That's all I can give you. The first thing the human fleet did was split. Not randomly, not chaotically. It was a split with a logic to it that I could see even through my damaged sensors, even without any reference point for what human military doctrine looked like. A portion of the fleet, maybe a third, curved away to the far side of Velkorath Station and took up positions between the station and the open space beyond, like they were building a wall. The remaining 2/3 went directly at the Gorethian fleet. The Gorethian fleet was substantial. We tracked it over 47 days. 17 warships of various classes with the Unbroken Meridian as the flagship, a vessel so large it was essentially a mobile weapons platform. The other 16 ranged from frigate size to destroyer class, all of them Gorethian built, which meant all of them were designed for the same operational philosophy, overwhelming force delivered without negotiation, followed by total claim of whatever was left. They had been entirely, brutally effective at this for 60 years. The humans came at them from a vector that the Gorethians couldn't have predicted, because the deceleration profile that had brought the human fleet to Velkorath was, I kept coming back to this, kept turning it over in my mind even as the battle was happening. It was something the Gorethian tactical systems would have assessed as physically impossible, so they probably hadn't planned for it. The first exchange of fire lit up my scanner so brightly that the overloaded sensors actually cut out for about 4 seconds. When they came back online, 2 of the Gorethian frigate-class vessels were gone. Not damaged, not retreating, gone in 4 seconds. I heard Jeth make a sound. It wasn't a word. It was the kind of sound a person makes when their understanding of the world shifts too fast for language to keep up. The Gorethians returned fire, Heavy fire, everything they had. The kinds of weapons that had dismantled the surface installations of 3 colony worlds in the past decade. Energy discharge readings that should have been catastrophic. The human ships, those dark, light-absorbing shapes, moved. I need you to understand that when I say moved, I mean something that doesn't map to how any ship I'd ever tracked on a scanner moved. They didn't arc. They didn't thrust correct. They changed position the way a thought changes, the way you go from thinking about one thing to thinking about another, and there's no mechanical process visible in the middle. It just happens. Gorethian fire hit empty space. Again and again. The human vessels were firing back during all of this, and I was watching the Gorethian fleet's profile on my scanner change in ways that told a very clear story even without the visual. 1 destroyer class, 3 more frigates, a support vessel of some kind, all of them gone. In the time it took me to process what I was seeing and start to believe it was real. The Gorethians were not, and I want to be careful about how I say this, because the Gorethians are not to be underestimated, and what happened that day doesn't mean they aren't dangerous or capable, but they were not winning this fight. They weren't close to winning this fight. Whatever they were firing at, they weren't hitting it. And whatever the humans were doing to them, they couldn't stop it or absorb it or outlast it. On the station, we were braced the way Admiral Merck had told us to brace. Vane Silos had relayed the instruction to everyone throughout the station in the few minutes before the battle started. We didn't know what we were bracing for exactly, but brace was clear enough. The shaking that came was not what I expected. I'd been in combat situations before. Weapons impacts have a certain character, a sharp, localized percussion that travels through hull material and arrives as a jarring thud. The shaking that happened when the human fleet engaged was different. It was wave-like, sustained, like the space around us was vibrating at a frequency that the station's structure was picking up. Like being inside something that's sitting next to a very large, very powerful engine. Orvani had wedged herself into the corner of her workstation with her back against the console housing and her feet against the opposite wall, and she was staring at the ceiling with an expression I can only describe as disbelief that had run out of energy and become something quieter. Acceptance, maybe, or just shock. Jeth had his hands back on the console and was taking readings, calm as if he was on a routine shift. I've always admired that about him. Even now. Whatever was happening around him, his answer was to gather data. There's a kind of courage in that doesn't look like courage until you think about it. The unbroken Meridian, the Gorethian flagship, had completed its weapon charge. On my scanner, that was clear. The full charge was there, peaked, ready to fire. 90 minutes of energy accumulation ready to be delivered. At what now? At human ships that moved like they didn't believe in being where weapons aimed. At a station that had just gone from condemned to something else. I watched the flagship's profile on my scanner. I watched it for a long, held-breath moment. And then the flagship began to change its orientation. Not toward the station, away from the station. It was turning. Slowly, something that large turns slowly no matter how powerful its thrusters, but it was turning. It was turning toward the human fleet. They're going to fire on the humans, I said. Vane Silos had come back to stand beside my station. She was watching the same readings. Full charge. Full charge, if they hit anything with that. The Admiral's voice came back through the open channel. Calm, no urgency, no drama, like he was reading a systems report. Velkorath Station, we're seeing the flagship reorienting. We anticipated this. Please stay braced. Admiral, Vane Silos said, that weapon at full charge is... We know what it is. We've been studying Gorethian weapons systems for 11 years. Another pause. It won't hit us. How can you be certain? The response was immediate. Because we're going to move it. I had no idea what that meant. I found out in the next 90 seconds. Approximately 40 of the human vessels, not all of them, maybe a tenth of the total fleet, broke from the engagement and converged on a position between the unbroken Meridian and the main human force. They didn't form a defensive line. They formed a shape I couldn't name and still can't name accurately. A curved surface. Like the inside of a bowl if you tried to build a bowl out of 40 warships in 3-dimensional space. The unbroken Meridian fired. The energy discharge that came off that weapon was the most intense reading I had ever seen on a sensor board in my life. Our instruments didn't just overload, they blew. 3 of our remaining 6 functional sensor arrays went dark permanently in that moment. The electromagnetic wash from the discharge hit the station like a pressure wave, and every light in the communications bay flickered and died for about 2 seconds before the emergency backups kicked in. 2 seconds of dark, 2 seconds of nothing but the sound of the station and the distant, felt-in-the-bones resonance of whatever was happening outside. When the lights came back, I had 3 functional sensor arrays, and on those 3 arrays, the unbroken Meridian had not been hit by its own weapon. The human fleet had not been hit by the weapon. The weapon had been redirected. I don't know the science of how. I'm a communications analyst, not a physicist. I don't have the framework to explain what those 40 human vessels had done to take a fully charged primary weapon discharge from a Gorethian flagship and send it somewhere other than where it had been aimed. But on my scanner, the energy signature tracked cleanly away from both the human fleet and the station and dispersed into empty space about 600,000 kilometers from the engagement. They had moved the weapon. Not dodged it, not absorbed it, moved it. Jeth had stopped writing down numbers. He was just staring at his console. "Jeth," I said, "what just happened?" He looked up at me. "And I want to tell you, Jeth Arvan, 12 years of coalition communications, 2 conflict postings, the calmest person I had ever worked beside, he looked genuinely lost, not scared. Lost, the way you look when something happens, that makes you question what you thought you understood about the way things work." "I don't know," he said. "I honestly don't know. The battle, if you can call it a battle when one side is comprehensively outmatched, in ways it doesn't even seem to understand yet, lasted approximately 38 more minutes after the flagship's discharge. I tracked it as best I could with 3 sensor arrays and systems running on backup power. I can tell you the broad shape of it. I can't give you precision. The Gorethians didn't break immediately. I want to credit them for that, even though I'm aware of what they came to Velkorath to do. They were a military force that had not encountered meaningful resistance in 60 years of expansion. Their doctrine was built on the assumption of superiority. Being wrong about that assumption, being this wrong, this suddenly and completely, requires a kind of rapid cognitive recalibration that most tactical systems, biological or mechanical, aren't built for. They tried 3 more formation shifts. They tried concentrating fire on single human vessels. They tried dispersal patterns. They tried, and this one was almost interesting to watch on the scanner in a grim way, they tried to put Velkorath Station between themselves and the human fleet, using us as a shield. The humans anticipated every one of these moves before it finished happening. I don't know if they had better tactical AI than the Gorethians. I don't know if their commanders were individually more gifted. I don't know if their sensor systems were so far superior that they could see what was coming before it arrived. Possibly all of these things, possibly something else entirely. But watching it on the scanner, watching the human fleet respond to Gorethian moves with what felt like foreknowledge, was one of the stranger experiences of my life. Like watching someone play a game they've already seen the outcome of. When the Gorethians tried to use the station as a shield, Vane Silos opened the channel herself. "Admiral Merck, they're moving toward us. We see it, we're adjusting, they won't reach you." "How close will they?" "They won't reach you, Commander, I promise you that. Tell your people." She looked at me, I looked at her. There was a moment, I remember it exactly, where we were just 2 people looking at each other, trying to decide whether to believe something we were being told by beings we had never heard of, about a technology we didn't understand, in a situation that was already so far beyond any framework we had that the frameworks had become useless. Vane Silos keyed the internal comm. "All stations, this is Commander Silos. Our allies have the situation. Stay braced. Stay calm. We are going to be okay." She said it firmly, like she believed it. I think she had decided to believe it, which is not the same thing as being certain, but it might be the more important thing. The Gorethians got to about 40,000 kilometers from the station before the human vessels on our far side, the third of the fleet that had taken up positions as a barrier, engaged them. What happened in the next 4 minutes destroyed the remainder of the Gorethian force attempting the shield maneuver, and it did it in a way that my damaged sensors could only partially capture, and what I did capture, I'm still not sure I processed correctly. What I know is that, when those 4 minutes were over, that portion of the Gorethian fleet was not a threat anymore. The unbroken Meridian attempted one final weapon charge. It got to maybe 30% before the human fleet did something. I saw an energy spike on my remaining sensors that didn't correspond to any weapon type I recognized, and the flagship's power systems went dark. Not destroyed, dark, like someone had thrown a switch. The unbroken Meridian drifted. The remaining Gorethian vessels, 4 of the original 17, all of them damaged to varying degrees, went to zero thrust. No power outputs beyond minimal life support. No weapon systems, no attempts to maneuver. 12 minutes after the flagship went dark, a Gorethian transmission went out on a frequency I recognized as their command channel. It was in Gorethian language. I don't speak Gorethian. None of us did. We found out later what it said. It said, "We are done. We yield this field, we request terms." It had been 60 years since the Gorethian Dominion had requested terms from anyone. The Battle of Velkorath Station was over. What comes after a battle is something nobody tells you about. In the histories and the tactical assessments and the strategic analyses, battles have clean edges. They start at a defined moment and end at a defined moment, and then you move into the political aftermath and the reconstruction phase and the formal documentation. It's all orderly in retrospect. In the actual experience of being there, the edges are not clean. For several minutes after the Gorethian transmissions went quiet, nobody on the station moved. Nobody spoke. We'd been under siege for 48 days. We'd been living with constant threat assessment and emergency protocols and rationing and fear, and the idea that it was just over didn't arrive in the brain the way you'd expect it to. It didn't arrive with relief, not immediately. It arrived as a kind of profound blankness, like the system had been running so hard for so long that when it no longer needed to run, it just sat there. Orvani was the first one to make a sound. She made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob, and then she slid down from her braced position and sat on the floor of the communications bay with her back against the console housing and her hands in her lap, and she just breathed. Big, slow breaths, like someone surfacing from very deep water. Jeth sat very still for a moment, then very methodically began saving every reading from the past 2 hours to every backup medium we had available, with the focus of someone who had decided that documentation was what the moment required and was pouring everything into it. I sat with my hands on my console and watched the scanner where the human fleet was now holding a stationary formation around Velkorath Station. 412 dark shapes, patient and present, not leaving, not advancing, just there, like they'd always been there, like they'd just been waiting for this moment to show themselves. The channel was still open. I said, "Admiral Merck." "A beat, Analyst Voss Anrin." I stopped. I wasn't sure what I was going to say. There were too many things. I tried to sort through them and pick one that made sense. That was the right first thing to say to someone who had just arrived from a star I'd never heard of and stopped an annihilation in progress. "Thank you," I said. I know that's not enough. I know that doesn't cover it, but thank you." A pause on the other end. Not the pause of someone not listening, the pause of someone receiving something carefully. "You held for 48 days, he said. "Your garrison, your commander, we tracked the communications through the siege. We know what happened. I want to be clear that what we did today was not us saving you. It was us arriving late to a situation you had already survived." I thought about Reth Osler and the bulkhead door on day 31. I thought about Vane Silos's anger and her gravity trick. I thought about 688 people who were still alive right now. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course." "You said you'd been watching, that you'd known about the Coalition and the Gorethian Dominion for 41 years. "Yes." "Why didn't you—" I stopped again, because the question had an edge to it, an accusation hiding inside it. "Why didn't you come sooner? Why did you wait? Why did 3 colony worlds have to go dark before you decided to come?" I didn't know if I had the right to ask that. I didn't know what the answer was going to be. "Why didn't we come before?" he said, not a question. He'd heard the shape of what I was trying to say. "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, there was something different in his voice, not less composed, but heavier, like something with weight behind it. "That is a question that deserves a real answer," he said. "And I will give you one, but not over a channel and not today. Today I want to make sure everyone on your station gets medical attention and whatever they need." Can you give me a status on your situation? I pulled up our current readouts. Life support, structural integrity, medical bay status, rations, population count. I started giving him numbers. And as I read off the damage and the need and the worn-down reality of 48 days of survival, I heard something I hadn't heard in 48 days. Movement on the far end of the channel. Quiet, purposeful movement. People receiving information and acting on it. An organization with resources, doing the thing that organizations with resources do when you give them a list of what's needed. It felt, I don't have a word that's quite right, like stepping in out of weather you'd been standing in for so long you'd forgotten it was weather. The first human shuttle docked at Velkorath Station's secondary airlock, approximately 2 hours after the battle ended. I wasn't there for the docking. I was still in the communications bay because we were still managing the post-battle coordination, and there was a lot of it. But I heard about it from Orvani, who had gone to meet it because she speaks 4 languages, and the command staff wanted someone who could communicate quickly if the humans' translation systems had any gaps. She came back about an hour later and sat down beside me, and just looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What?" I said. There she paused. "They look like us, like Ithori almost, 2 legs, 2 arms, similar height range. Bilateral symmetry, forward-facing eyes, flexible vocal apparatus. The face configuration is different enough that you know immediately they're not Ithori, but in a suit or at a distance." "What are they like?" Another pause. She seemed to be searching for the right description. "They're efficient," she said finally. "The team that came through, 8 of them, they had a medical assessment kit set up and running diagnostics on the first patient before the airlock had finished cycling. They were talking quietly among themselves, but never to us in a way that felt like they were ignoring us. More like they were concentrating, like whatever they were doing had their full attention. Were they? I wasn't sure how to phrase this. Did it seem like a big deal to them, being here? Orvani thought about it. "No," she said. "And yes, the efficiency felt automatic, like they do this all the time. But there was one of them, the team lead, I think, a woman with dark hair, short, moved like she'd spent a lot of time in low-G environments, who stopped when she came through the airlock and looked around at the station. Just for a second. Just one moment where she stopped being efficient and was just looking, taking it in, and her face." "What?" "She looked moved," Orvani said. "The way you look when you've been told something terrible happened somewhere and you arrive and see the evidence of it with your own eyes. Like the information had been abstract before, and now it wasn't abstract anymore." I thought about that. An alien being from a star none of us had ever heard of, standing in our airlock and feeling something when she saw what we looked like after 48 days. "Is she still there?" I asked. "She moved on with the rest of the team. They've got patients to see." Orvani leaned back in her chair. "The medical equipment they brought Sierra, I don't know what half of it does. But I watched them run a diagnostic assessment on Dr. Fenrath. He'd taken some indirect blast trauma in week 2. We've had him on pain management since then because we didn't have the capacity to do more. And in about 4 minutes they had a complete picture of his injuries and a treatment plan, and one of them was already prepping whatever implements they use. 4 minutes. I thought about our medical bay, about Dr. Nessick, our ship's physician, who had been doing 18-hour shifts for 48 days with equipment that had been losing functionality the entire time. About the triage decisions she'd been making with limited supplies and limited tools. "Is she going to be okay, Dr. Fenrath?" "They said full recovery." Orvani's voice had gone quiet. "They said it like it was obvious, like of course, full recovery, why would the answer be anything else?" I sat with that for a moment. Full recovery. The Gorethians gone. 688 people still alive. Human ships holding position around a station that was still standing. The weight of 48 days was still sitting on me. It wasn't going to lift all at once. These things don't lift all at once. But underneath it, something was starting to move. Something that had been completely shut down because there was no room for it while we were just trying to survive. Hope is a very specific feeling. I'd forgotten what it felt like. Admiral Theo Merck came to the station 3 days after the battle. He came on a small shuttle, with a security detail of 4 individuals and no other formality. No ceremony. No advance notice beyond a brief communication asking if Commander Silos had time for a meeting, delivered in the same tone one colleague might use to ask another colleague if they were free for a working lunch. I was there because Vane Silos had asked me to be there. She'd said, "You were on the comm when they arrived. You talked to him first. It seems right that you're in the room." I appreciated that. She didn't have to do that. He was not what I expected. I don't know what I expected. Something more imposing, maybe. After what I'd seen on the scanner. After 412 vessels and redirected weapon discharges and a fleet that moved like nothing in our database. I think some part of my brain had built the Admiral into something mythological, something that would look the part. He was a human male of average height by what I later learned were human standards, which put him at the shorter end of Ithori stature. He had gray at the sides of his dark hair, and the kind of tan that comes from spending time on the surface of a world with a strong star. Something I noticed because most people who work primarily in space lose that quality over time. His hands were calloused. He moved carefully and deliberately, like someone who had learned to pay attention to every room they entered. His eyes were human eyes look different from Ithori eyes. We have a third eyelid, a translucent one that humans don't have. Their irises are larger proportionally, and they don't reflectively adapt to light changes the way ours do. His were a dark gray-brown color, steady, the kind of eyes that made you feel like they were actually looking at you rather than at the space around you. He shook hands with Commander Silos. The handshake is a human greeting. We learned this later. It's a cultural behavior that dates back to their earliest written history, a gesture of showing an empty weapon hand. He offered it because she extended her own hand first, curious, having been briefed on the custom. Then he looked at me. "Analyst Voss Anrin," he said. "You're the one who answered the hail." "Yes, sir." "You sounded very calm." "I wasn't," I said. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, something more contained than that. "No, I don't suppose you were." We sat at the conference table in Vane Silos' office, which was really just a slightly larger section of corridor that had been partitioned off and given a table and a few chairs, because the actual administrative spaces had been damaged in week 2. The humans sat across from us. Admiral Merck and his security detail, though the security detail clearly understood that their role here was symbolic and sat quietly with the relaxed readiness of people who weren't worried about anything in this room. Vane Silos asked the question I'd asked on the channel. The one about why they'd waited. He didn't deflect it this time. He sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment, and then he answered. "We have been aware of the Galactic Assembly's political systems for 41 years, he said. "We have been monitoring communications, studying languages, assessing the situation. We made a decision early in that process that we would not insert ourselves into coalition or dominion affairs without a clear ethical justification. We are," he paused, choosing the word. "We are cautious about that, about the impact of our arrival on civilizations that haven't asked for us." 3 colony worlds went dark, Vane Silos said. Her voice was controlled, but barely. "I know. Harvani's Setara, Delvin Minor. 67,000 people. I know. And you were watching." He held her gaze. "We were watching and debating. Internally, our own political processes are complicated, Commander. We are not a unified voice. We are," he seemed to search for the right framing. "We are a species with a great deal of difficulty agreeing on what is right. Some of us said we had no right to intervene in conflicts between civilizations that hadn't invited us. Some said our capabilities created an obligation. Some were afraid of what our arrival would mean. Not for you." "For us." "What changed?" I asked. He looked at me. "Your signal, the Velkorath signal." A pause. "I need to be honest. It wasn't the first distress signal we'd intercepted, but it was different in character." "The person running your communications." "Analyst Arvin, Jeth Arvin." He was running the signal on 43 different frequencies simultaneously, rotating them in a sequence that he'd clearly calculated to maximize the probability of reaching any listening system at any range. He'd also embedded metadata in the signal structure that gave anyone who received it enough information to assess the situation without requiring a return channel. It was very clever work. I made a mental note to tell Jeth this. He would be very quietly pleased about it, which was the only way Jeth was ever pleased about anything. "That brought it to my attention specifically," Merck continued, "and I took it to our governing council, and we argued for 4 days. And then we came." Vane Silos was quiet for a moment. 67,000 people, she said again. Yes. On those 3 worlds. Yes. You watched. Yes, he said it without flinching, without qualifying it. Just yes. As if he'd already had this argument with himself and reached a conclusion about it that he wasn't going to avoid or redirect. That failure belongs to us. I will not explain it away. Something in Vane Silos's face shifted. It's a strange thing to watch someone receive an apology that's genuine but insufficient. She knew he meant it. She knew 67,000 people were still gone. She knew both of those things at the same time. She said, "Don't let it happen again." He said, "No." That was the whole thing. That was the moment. 2 words and the weight of a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire galactic region. Not a treaty, not a ceremony. Just 2 people in a damaged station looking at each other and one of them saying no. The debrief that happened in the following weeks taught us things about humans that I've been thinking about ever since. The technology was part of it, obviously. Their propulsion systems operated on principles our physics hadn't developed, not because the principles were unavailable to us, but because we'd gone in different directions with our foundational research, developed different frameworks built on different assumptions. The defensive array they'd used to redirect the unbroken Meridian's weapon discharge was an application of spatial geometry manipulation that our theorists had considered mathematically possible for years, but had never developed practically because the energy requirements seemed prohibitive. Humans had solved the energy problem through a different architecture entirely. Their medical technology was similarly divergent, not more advanced in a simple linear sense, but developed along lines that had produced tools and techniques we hadn't arrived at, in some cases, tools that addressed biological problems we didn't even know how to identify yet. But the technology wasn't the part that stayed with me. What stayed with me was the people. The team that came through first, the medical team, was 8 individuals from what I later learned were 4 different countries of origin on their home planet. A planet that, unlike the relatively homogeneous colony worlds of the Coalition, had developed in geographic and cultural isolation across hundreds of separate political units that had only recently, in their last few centuries, begun integrating. Those 8 people were from 4 different places, spoke 4 different native languages before they had a common tongue, had cultural practices and belief systems that didn't entirely overlap. And they worked together like, I keep coming back to the word seamless, and it's not quite right because it wasn't the absence of friction. It was more like they developed a practice of working through friction so established that it was invisible from the outside, like a joint that's been used so long it moves smoothly. I talked to one of the medical team members a few days after the first docking. Her name was Dr. Priya Anand. She was the short, dark-haired woman Orvani had described at the airlock, the one who had stopped and looked at the station and been moved by it. She came back to check on the patients she'd treated, and we ended up talking in the small common area near the medical bay for maybe an hour. Her standard galactic was perfect, which was apparently because all crew members of the expeditionary fleet had spent years in language immersion before departure. She asked questions constantly, not like an interrogator, but like someone who is genuinely hungry for information and has trained herself to ask rather than assume. At one point she asked me what it had been like during the siege, not militarily, personally, what it had been like to be a person inside it. It was a strange question. Nobody had asked me that yet. Everyone in the aftermath had been focused on the tactical and logistical and political dimensions. Priya Anand wanted to know what it had felt like. I told her some of it, about the sound of the hum, about Commander Osler, about the children in the school section who we'd tried so hard to keep as far from the reality of what was happening as possible, and whether we'd succeeded at all, and whether the fact that we'd tried had mattered or just meant they'd had less time to prepare for something unsurvivable. She listened. She didn't try to fix it or contextualize it or tell me the children were fine now and the station was saved and so really it was okay. She just listened. At the end she said, "The children are okay. We assessed all of them. They're scared and they're not sleeping well and 2 of them are having nightmares that we're going to want to watch. But they're okay." I hadn't asked. She'd known I needed to know anyway. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The thing about humans, or at least the humans I met in those weeks, was that they seemed to move between modes of functioning without visible seams. The efficiency at the airlock and the stillness in the conversation. The enormous destructive capability of their fleet and the doctor who stopped to look at the station and feel something about it. The admiral who answered a question about 67,000 dead people with yes, without flinching. I mentioned this to Vane Silos one evening, the combination of things, how they were. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about it. There's a word in some of their languages, she said. I've been reading the cultural files they gave us access to. The concept exists in most of their major language groups, though the words are different. It's the idea that the capacity for great harm and the capacity for great care are not opposites, that they coexist, that a species develops one in proportion to the other. That sounds, I tried to find the word, frightening. Yes, she said, and reassuring in equal measure. I think that's the most precise description of how humans feel that I've encountered, frightening and reassuring in equal measure, not because their capabilities are ambiguous, they're clearly vast, but because the thing that drives those capabilities seems to be something genuine, not power for its own sake, not conquest for the sake of expansion. They came because someone was asking for help, and they were capable of providing it. Whether that's enough, whether good intentions and enormous capability are sufficient, long-term, to navigate the kind of complicated galactic politics we're now all going to be navigating together, I don't know. Nobody knows yet. It's too new. But I was there when Admiral Merck said no to Vane Silos's "Don't let it happen again," and I have thought about that one syllable many times since. The way it landed, the weight in it, not a promise made lightly, not a bureaucratic response, something chosen. I want to tell you about the last thing that happened before the human fleet left the Velkorath system. It was 8 days after the battle. The station was largely stabilized. The human engineering teams had worked alongside our own engineers for most of those 8 days, and the structural damage that had been accumulating over 48 days of siege was being addressed at a rate that our own people couldn't have achieved alone. The Gorethian prisoners, the surviving crew of the 4 remaining vessels, had been transferred to a human detention facility under protocols we didn't entirely understand but were learning. The unbroken Meridian, its system still dark, was being towed somewhere by a small group of human vessels for what Admiral Merck had diplomatically described as technical assessment. The station was going to be okay. That had gone from something we said to keep each other going to something that was demonstrably true. I was in the observation ring, one of the few parts of the station that had remained undamaged through the siege, a transparent hulled section that ran the circumference of the outer torus and gave a panoramic view of the space around us, watching the human fleet hold its position. That early morning quality that observation rings get, with the star on one side and deep space on the other and everything in between very still. Admiral Merck found me there. He was alone, which surprised me. He'd always had at least some of his security detail nearby. He said, "Mind if I watch a bit?" I said, "No, of course not." He stood beside me at the transparent hull and looked out at his fleet. Those 412 dark shapes, patient against the stars. I thought about what it must feel like to have brought them here. To have argued for 4 days in whatever political process humans use and won the argument, and then to have actually done it. Crossed whatever distance separated Sol from Velkorath, with 412 ships and everyone aboard them, to deal with something happening to people you'd never met. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "You can always ask me something," he said. "Why do you?" I was trying to find the right version of the question. "Your species has been watching the Coalition and the Dominion for 41 years. You stayed back. You built up your understanding. You debated. And then you came, and what you brought was," I gestured at the fleet. "This, not a single ship, not an envoy, 412 warships. Yes. When you commit completely." A pause. He seemed to be considering how to answer. "When we were arguing," he said, "about whether to come, one side of the argument was that we had no right to involve ourselves in affairs that weren't ours, that we might do more harm than good, that the dynamics of the galactic region were beyond our understanding. All of these things have merit." He paused. "The other side of the argument was simpler. There were people asking for help, and we were capable of helping. And that was enough to override all the other arguments." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at his fleet. "No," he said, It wasn't enough, not in the abstract, people asking for help and our capability to provide it. Those two things by themselves don't override concerns about unintended consequences and political interference and all the rest of it. He paused. What was enough was the signal, the specific character of the signal, the way your colleague had constructed it, the details of what was happening and what your people had done with 48 days of impossible circumstances. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a report. Someone was documenting meticulously what was happening and broadcasting it in the hope that someone who received it would have the context to understand it. He turned to look at me. That kind of signal implies something about the people sending it, about the quality of the minds involved, about the values that built the station and held it for 48 days and kept broadcasting even in the last hour. He paused. We didn't come because you needed us. We came because of what you are. I didn't know what to say to that. He turned back to the transparent hull. After a moment, we're going to be establishing a formal liaison presence in the coalition, a small team to start. The political processes on our side will be slow, and the negotiations on yours will be even slower, but I wanted to tell you the conversation has started. It's not going to stop. Will you be going back? I have to. There's a lot of work to be done at home. He paused. The fleet will remain in the region, a portion of it. Admiral Vashti Kaur will command the garrison presence. She's good. Better than me, honestly, at the patient kind of work, the relationship building, the coordination. I'm better suited to the part that's already done. I thought about 412 ships. Thought about a portion of them staying in our region. Thought about what that meant for the Gorethian Dominion, which was suddenly going to have to recalculate 60 years of strategic assumptions. The Gorethians, I said, what happens now? That's a question for a lot of people over a lot of years, he said. Not just us, not just your coalition, everyone in the region who's been dealing with them. My hope is that what happened here, the fact that there is now a different answer to the question of what happens when the Gorethians decide to move, changes the calculation enough that they make different choices. A pause. Humans are not naturally optimistic about that kind of change. We have a lot of history of it not working. But we're also not the only factor in the calculation. What does that mean? He looked at me again, something in his expression that I later decided was gentleness maybe, deliberate chosen gentleness. It means that you held a station for 48 days, he said, against a force that had never been effectively opposed. And everything you built, everything that kept those 688 people alive, that doesn't disappear now that we're here. You built something real, it exists, it matters. The fleet was very still against the stars. A patrol pattern I could see now, watching them long enough, that it wasn't a static hold but a slow, deliberate orbit around the station, each ship tracing a path through the space they'd fought for 8 days ago. I thought about Reth Osler. I thought about Vane Silos and her anger that had given us 14 extra days. I thought about Jeth's signal on 43 frequencies, constructed with the mathematical clarity of someone who believed, against all evidence, that someone was out there to receive it. I thought about how the universe is full of distances that seem impossible and voices that seem too small to carry across them. And sometimes they don't carry, and sometimes they do. Thank you, I said again, for the second time. He said what he'd said the first time. You held. And that was enough. That was, in fact, everything. I've been back on Velkorath Station for 3 years now. The reconstruction took 8 months, a combination of coalition resources and human engineering contributions that produced a facility significantly better than the one that had existed before the siege, which prompted a small ethical debate about whether it was appropriate to benefit from the attack in infrastructure terms. A debate that concluded with everyone agreeing that since the alternative was worse infrastructure, we should accept the good. Jeth still works in communications. He runs the department now. He has added 31 new emergency frequency protocols based on his analysis of what worked and what didn't during the siege. He is also, quietly, in correspondence with a human signals theorist who saw his work from the battle records and found it. I believe the word used was elegant. Jeth was very quietly pleased. Orvani took a posting with the new Joint Coalition Human Liaison Office that Admiral Kaur established in the region. She is apparently very good at the work, which surprises no one who knows her. Vane Silos was promoted to full commander of the Velkorath defense sector and oversaw the rebuilding of the garrison. now significantly larger, with additional weapons and better coordinated defenses. She is also one of the primary contacts for the human garrison fleet, which remains in the region. I've heard that she and Admiral Kor have developed a productive working relationship, which I read as code for two very capable, very stubborn people finding an equilibrium through sheer mutual respect. The Gorethian Dominion has not expanded in 3 years. There are political fractures within their internal structure that our intelligence services are monitoring, and the human liaison teams are monitoring in parallel. Whether those fractures lead somewhere better or somewhere worse, I don't know yet. Nobody does. Dr. Fenrath fully recovered. He's working on a research project now that incorporates data from 3 new species contacts that have been made possible by the opening of human channels. He is 93 years old and has the energy of someone 30 years younger and no apparent intention of stopping. And me, I still work in communications. I'm a senior analyst now, which is a title that comes with more administrative responsibility than I entirely wanted. But there it is. I run the department that manages our contact with the human fleet presence in the region, the daily coordination, the frequency management, the translation verification, the 1,000 small technical tasks of keeping a channel open between people who are still learning each other's habits and assumptions. I talk to humans most days. I have developed something I would cautiously describe as friendships with 3 or 4 of them. Cautiously because friendship across such a large gap of reference and experience and biology is a complicated thing to assess. But there are people in that fleet whose voices I'm glad to hear, who ask questions about things I didn't expect them to be curious about, and who answer questions I didn't know I was brave enough to ask. I've thought about that signal a lot. The 43 frequencies, the carefully structured metadata, Jeth's mathematical optimism broadcasting into the dark. I've thought about what it means that it worked. About what it says about the universe, or maybe just about our particular small corner of it. That someone on the other end was listening and had the capacity to respond, and decided that capacity created an obligation. It's not a comfortable thought entirely. Comfort would be too simple for what it actually is, because the question it raises, what do you do when you can help and someone needs it, is not a question with an easy answer. Humans have been arguing about it among themselves for as long as they've had language to argue in, and they haven't resolved it, and they're not going to resolve it. But they came. With 412 ships, in the last 6 minutes of the last hour they came. And I was there. I was sitting at a communications console in a battered station that had 6 minutes left, and I answered the hail, and everything was different after. I still hear that hum sometimes, in the quiet, in the moment between sleeping and waking when the brain hasn't fully engaged its filters yet. That low, teeth-vibrating resonance of something massive drawing power and deciding it's done waiting. And then I hear the scanner alarm, and Irvani's voice saying 412 contacts, and the channel opening, and a voice from a star I'd never heard of, speaking perfect standard galactic in a ship-to-shore tone that carried no drama and no ceremony but was, somehow, the most profoundly reassuring sound I had ever heard in my life. We have your distress signal. We have had your distress signal for 29 days. We apologize for the delay. We are here now. We are here now. 3 years later, I still don't have a better sentence than that. For what it means to be a person in a universe this large, this complicated, this full of distances that seem impassable and threats that seem unsurvivable.